Thanks, Caroline. Let me start by, first of all, trying to explain what a citizens' assembly is, because I get the impression there's been a bit of a misapprehension, not least among some members of the journalistic fraternity in this country, about what it is or what it's not. So what a citizens' assembly is not, it's not a competitor to the Dáil Éireann. It's not seeking to replace or add an additional house to the legislature. It's not a threat to our system of representative government. Its role, in contrast, its role is to supplement our representative institutions, to help perhaps with taking of contentious or complex issues that sometimes can be quite difficult to work through. A citizens' assembly can be a perfect device for doing this. So put simply, a citizens' assembly is a bottom-up process of deliberation and debate by citizens, by ordinary citizens. To use the more technical jargon, it's normally referred to as a form of participatory democracy. And this can have various different names. We've chosen in our endeavour to call this a citizens' assembly, but it's got a lot of other names in the 2 decades or so that this kind of method has been used around the world. There's examples of participatory budgeting as far away as Brazil or in parts of Germany or the United States. The citizens' assemblies on electoral reform that I've been involved with in British Columbia, Ontario and the Netherlands. There's citizens' juries, deliberative polls in a number of the world's democracies and indeed non-democracies. So it's an extremely well-used device in a number of other countries, but it's not something that's been used on a large scale here before. It can have different names, as I said. We've chosen to call it a citizens' assembly. But what they all tend to share in common are the following sorts of steps. And that's what we sought to do here in Dublin also. Random selection. So the idea is that the members of the Citizens' Assembly are selected through a random process. They're not elected. They're not representing sectoral interests. They are ordinary citizens who we have approached as a result of a random process of selection. There's a clearly defined agenda and a set of outcomes. That would be an ideal if a government was running a Citizens' Assembly, that they would set it an agenda, changing the electoral system, or whether you're going to abolish the Seanad, or whatever it might be. And then the outcome of the Citizens' Assembly, it would be clear what that outcome is going to be. Is there going to be a referendum question, for example? The role of expert witnesses is crucial, that you should have acknowledged expert witnesses and briefing documents produced by those witnesses, and the possibility for the members of the Citizens' Assembly to grill those witnesses at their leisure. And then at the heart of it all is deliberation. The idea of citizens coming together for an extended period of time, debating and deliberating, becoming more aware of the nuances associated with a particular issue that they're debating, and being able to come to a decision about it. So they're the 4 key steps that we should expect to find in any form of participatory democracy like our Citizens' Assembly. So our project, Caroline's introduced the sort of origins and everything, but let me just sort of try and fasten in on the academic side, which is the bit of the project that I was most involved with. Our principal rationale is to show that participatory democracy can work, and particularly that it can work in Ireland. We know it works in other countries, but the challenge that those of us who got the funding met whenever we tried to talk about it was, yeah, but we're different here. It's one thing for the Canadians or the Chinese or the Brazilians to do this, but this is Ireland and we do things differently here. So we thought, okay, let's go out and do it. Let's try and show that this can actually work. So this is why we have invested so much in our survey work, as you'll see in a moment. This was a pilot. We're not pretending anything other than this was a pilot. This was an experiment that shows how a process like this could work if done on a proper scale, in a proper funded scale, a properly organised scale by the government of the day. So we didn't have the advantages that would normally go with a full Citizens' Assembly. We didn't focus on one agenda item. We focused, as you'll see in a minute, on a number of different items to try and make sure that we are having the maximum possibility to measure change among our members. We only had a weekend in Kilmainham, in the Royal Hospital Kilmainham, a beautiful venue, but we had a day and a half there. The ones I was involved with in Canada met for a year. We sought private funding from Atlantic Philanthropies. Ideally, a process like this should be sponsored by and organised under the auspices of the government of the day, because the object is that it's going to be a worthwhile endeavour that's going to deliver for that government a possible solution to their problems. So what we did was we found 100 citizens. 100 citizens, a random selection, 50-50 male-female, a very good representation of all the regions of this country, as well as you can get with 100 people, a very good representation of ages and also of socioeconomic backgrounds. And And what we were looking for, the object of the endeavour as far as the academic research is concerned, is we're looking for two main sets of expected outcomes. We're looking for shifts on policy. We're looking for evidence that having been given more information about the policy that they were discussing and the possibility to deliberate at some leisure about it and hearing expert witnesses, do they shift in views? Do they understand a bit more the nuances of the particular policy? Can they see the trade-offs that might be involved in going for route A rather than route B? And secondly, we were looking for evidence that citizens are more empowered, that they actually feel as citizens that they have had a role, that they've been given the trust to do something in politics for change. And as a result, they return that trust, that they feel empowered as citizens. They're the two main sources of information that we're trying to do. So let me try and represent this diagrammatically. Joe only gave me 10 minutes, so I have to do this quite quickly. You know what he's like. June 25th, 26th, as Caroline said, our Citizens' Assembly in Royal Hospital, Kilmainham, 100 members. To get to the 100 citizens, we first of all had to carry out a survey. And if you saw in the Irish Times last week, the 3 articles that we published relating to the first survey, the survey of 1,242 of 18-plus population around the country, a standard representative survey of the Irish population carried out by Ipsos MRBI. And at the end of that survey, they invited people to say if they were available on that particular weekend and whether they'd be interested on that particular weekend to come to Dublin. And out of that, we produced our 100 citizens. So these 100 citizens were paid, their travel costs were paid. They didn't receive any honorarium or any fee for their time, just that their costs were covered. They were brought to Dublin. They received briefing documents produced by experts about the issues they were going to discuss the next day. They then had the opportunity to hear those experts talk about the issues, to grill those experts. They wandered around the room and talked to the citizens, again, over quite a period of time, and then they deliberated. So we had briefing documents, expert witnesses, and deliberation. We had the three of the key things that you need to have in a process like this. And then the Citizens' Assembly finished. They made their recommendations. You can find those on our website. But then the work really began. The work that my colleagues, Jane Souter, Owen O'Malley, Elaine Byrne and myself are now working on, the data we're working on. And this is where all the survey work has really started. So Ipsos MRBI went back into the field. They repeat surveyed those 100 Citizens' Assembly members with exactly the same survey, precisely the same questions. And they then went and surveyed 500 of the original sample who hadn't come to the Citizens' Assembly and therefore had not received the briefing documents or had the possibility to deliberate. And they also interviewed another fresh sample of 500 citizens who hadn't been surveyed before, in all instances with exactly the same survey instrument. In other words, what we have produced in the red box is a control group, or 2 control groups. 2 bodies of citizens who have not been involved in the Citizens' Assembly in any shadow, in any way or form. So that what we now are doing, the data was delivered to us only last week, so over the next couple of weeks we're going to be processing those data to explore to what extent our 100 Citizens' Assembly members' views shifted and how they shifted in a measurable way vis-à-vis our control group. Now, those data have only been produced, so I can't talk to you about them today. But I do have some preliminary findings that I can talk about, because I did promise Joe I'd have something. What we've managed to do so far is do some initial analysis of the survey work of the 100 Citizens' Assembly members, before and after. So we have 2 time points, and we have the Citizens' Assembly that occurs in the middle. So what I wanted to show you are some preliminary headline findings, trying to demonstrate the sort of effects that I mentioned a few minutes ago we were looking for. So, and I'll be quick here. Here are 3 sets of findings. So here's the first question. On the Saturday, we had a lot of discussion about political reform, and particularly about the role of a Dáil deputy. And one of the survey questions was, what percentage of their time should TDs spend on national issues? We kind of know what the real situation is. We all live in this wonderful country. But this was, in the blue box there, are the situation for the male Citizens' Assembly members before the Citizens' Assembly weekend. So that proportion within the blue box felt that between 3/4 to 100% of the TD's time should be spent on national issues. It looks like about 1/3. And then these are the women members of the Citizens' Assembly. They think even less of the time of TDs should be spent on national issues. So that's the situation in time point 1 before the Citizens' Assembly weekend. Then they heard expert witnesses. They heard Ken Carty, Theresa Reedy, Clodagh Harris. They had the possibility to grill them. They had the possibility to debate and deliberate in some detail. And then we survey them again. Same question within a week, within a couple of days of the Citizens' Assembly weekend. And as you can see, the boxes have shifted quite significantly, particularly in the case of the female members of the Citizens' Assembly weekend, that they now think the role of the TD should be much more focused on national issues than they had thought before. So that's, I think, a very good example of the sort of policy shifts that one might expect with this. Now, that, in a sense, is not the most difficult of questions to think about. So what about tax and spending? Tax rises and spending cuts. So here's the situation in taxes. Before the weekend, a very small number in the blue box were in favour of tax cuts. No surprise. By the, tax rises, I beg your pardon. I always get that confused. It's I don't know. Anyway, after the weekend, as you can see, a dramatic shift. People are beginning to appreciate that there's important trade-offs. If you're not prepared to pay more taxes, what are you going to surrender? Where are the cuts going to fall? So there's quite a dramatic shift on that. Now, we had Nat O'Connor from Task and Fergal O'Brien from IBEC as our expert witnesses. So we had a strong representation from both left of centre and right of centre, providing expert witness statements to those citizens throughout the Sunday of discussions on this. Here's the situation on cuts, spending cuts. Again, a shift. Again, a recognition that in some instances spending cuts do need to be considered, although on a scale of things the tax movement is more dramatic. And here's another way of looking at it. Here's a series of questions, and I'm very nearly finished, Caroline, on property taxes, water charges, whether we should sell our state assets, whether we should introduce student fees. And these were the proportions of our Citizens' Assembly members before the weekend. So 40% of our Citizens' Assembly members were in favour of property taxes before the weekend. Here's the situation. I mean, Phil Hogan would be delighted with this one. Here's the situation after the weekend. Property taxes, water charges and student fees, a significantly greater number are now in favour of all of those things. No one wants them. No one likes the idea. It's just that they've come to understand the significance of saying no to that when you have to consider what else you're going to give on. And a significantly lower number of people in favour of selling state assets after the weekend. So there's two areas of shift on policy. And I said that was the first thing we wanted to look for, shift on policy. The second thing I said we wanted to look for, the final thing we wanted to look for was, do citizens feel more empowered? Do they feel more engaged as citizens? So here's just one example. Willingness to get involved in political issues. And as you can see, a very dramatic shift in favour of being more willing to be involved in politics after having been involved in that Citizens' Assembly weekend. Pretty dramatic shifts. So these are very preliminary findings. I'm making no pretense that this is the end of the story. We are only just beginning our real data analysis. But what are the potential applications? What's the point of doing this academic exercise? What's the point of it all? Is it just a waste of time for people like myself to enjoy ourselves? We're saying no. We're saying there are some real hard applications that people would listen for a while about the possibility. And every single party talked in the last election in their manifestos, every party, including the ones on this podium, about citizen-engaged, bottom-up processes of deliberation. Some of them even use the phrase Citizens' Assembly. So here are the sort of applications. A major constitutional question of the moment. Do we want to change our electoral system? Give it to a Citizens' Assembly to debate the pros and cons and what might be an alternative electoral system that could be then put to the people in a referendum. Or do we want to abolish the Seanad? Give that to a Citizens' Assembly to decide before you have the referendum campaign on it. Important but tricky policy questions. Church and state is a bit in the news right now. Wouldn't it be nice to have a group of ordinary citizens, a random selection of ordinary citizens, debate at their leisure about the future of our relations, between the church and state in this country, and let them come up with recommendations for our politicians? Major infrastructural challenges, Metro North in the Dublin area, but there are many in communities the length and breadth of this country where there are going to be vested interests will have views, very long-held views in some cases. Let citizens have some say in that. Or local government budgeting, participatory budgeting. If we ever get to the day where local government is funded locally, then why not let the citizens have a say over, let's say, 10% of that budget, over how that might be spent? There's a good example in 100 places around the world of this sort of process working very well. So I'll conclude. Winston Churchill was a great man for quotes. You mentioned Truman. Winston Churchill was another one we always pull up from time to time. And sometimes his quotes are spot on, but sometimes they're completely wrong. And this, I think, is one where I would fundamentally disagree with him. The biggest argument against democracy, he said, is a 5-minute discussion with the average voter. I think what we've shown here is that that's wrong. If you give the average citizen the possibility, you trust in the average citizen enough to give them the possibility to talk seriously about issues that matter in this country, they can do it, and they will return that trust. Thank you. Yeah, what
have the experts who talk to them and who convince them of tax, need to pay tax, and so on?
Joe's asking me what exactly happened at the weekend, and he's right, I should have explained the structure of the weekend. So I'll give you the example of the Sunday morning, from 9:30 to about 1 o'clock, I think it was. On the Saturday evening, they received a briefing document that had been produced by Nat O'Connor of Task and Farrell of IBEC, talking about the tax versus spending dimension and the issues that you need to consider on both sides. Two views. And it was clear which was Nat's view and which was Fergal's view. And they agreed the document between them. And then at the start of the Sunday morning, Nat O'Connor and Farrell O'Brien then talked to their briefing documents, much like we're doing here. So 15-minute presentations from each of them about what was the gist of what was in those briefing documents. And then the citizens were all in small group tables. There were 8 citizens to a table with a trained facilitator and a note taker at each table. And they then had a period of time to have initial discussions about those issues to see if they understood everything, with Nat O'Connor and Farrell O'Brien being available to go to any table to give points of clarification. Then there was a plenary discussion when initial ideas were being brought forward. So where Fiat McAneil, as our chair, then took questions from the table and statements from the table about areas of recommendations that might be coming up. And then it went back to small group discussions where they were invited to come up with a set of recommendations. And those recommendations then went on to a ballot paper which was posted to them, and they voted on those recommendations, and the results of those recommendations are on our website. So it was being involved in this trial, in this pilot, because this is clearly not long enough to do this in the way it really needs to be done. We completely agree with that point that's often been made. But they were given this opportunity to hear relevant experts who know about this area, to grill those experts, and then to debate among themselves, among their peers, about the issues. And then we questioned them with a survey the following week.
In other words, if our electorate were more educated, they might make different decisions.
Certainly a better educated, apropos your session after supper tonight, a better educated electorate, we all know that, is a better informed electorate is a better electorate.
David, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. We've allowed